I am Hamish Macbeth, and welcome to the Crimson Noir.
A thick, pearlescent fog had descended upon Lochdubh, rolling off the sea and smothering the village in a freezing, silent embrace. It was the sort of heavy, blinding mist that erased the towering shapes of the surrounding mountains and muffled the usual morning clatter of the harbour. There was no rain, just a damp, bone-chilling chill that clung to the skin. For Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, it was the perfect weather for doing absolutely nothing. Hamish sat slouched on an overturned wooden creel near the waterfront, his long, lanky frame huddled deep inside his greatcoat. His flaming red hair, entirely unacquainted with a comb that morning, stuck out in damp tufts from beneath his peaked cap. Beside him, his dog, Lugs, let out a long, shuddering sigh, buried his nose beneath his paws, and went back to sleep. In one hand, Hamish nursed a thermos cup of fiercely hot, black coffee. It was barely 8 inches the morning, a time when Detective Chief Inspector Blair, sitting in his heated office at police headquarters in Strathbane, would expect a dutiful village bobby to be at his desk, eagerly filling out triplicate forms regarding stray sheep or missing bicycles. Naturally, Hamish was doing his utmost to be entirely invisible. If the fog hid him from the world, it also hid him from the telephone at the police station, which he knew had been ringing insistently for the past 20 minutes. He took a slow sip of the coffee, letting the warmth spread through his chest. He was just contemplating whether it was too early to head back to the station, to put a pot of stew on his beloved cast iron stove, when the peace of the morning was rudely shattered. The intrusion did not come in the form of a purring luxury engine. Lochdubh's treacherous, winding single-track roads were notoriously hostile to such low-slung, expensive vehicles. Instead, the heavy silence was broken by the wheezing, gear-grinding, asthmatic arrival of the local postbus. It lurched out of the white mist and gasped to a halt outside Patel's shop. The doors clattered open, and out stepped a man who looked as though he had been outfitted by a theatrical costumer who had only read about the Scottish Highlands in glossy society magazines. He was a Sassenach, quite clearly. He wore immaculate, rust-coloured tweed +4s, a pristine deerstalker hat, and a pair of hiking boots that had never seen so much as a puddle, let alone a peat bog. He carried a silver-tipped walking stick and possessed a booming nasal English voice that immediately cut through the soft, muffled air. "I say, is there a porter? Someone to fetch my bags to the hotel. The service in this place is positively prehistoric." Archie McLean, the local fisherman, who smelled faintly of diesel oil and stale beer, stopped hauling his nets and stared at the newcomer, as if he were a particularly large, brightly coloured insect. Hamish sighed softly, the mist swirling around his boots. He shrank, slightly lower on his creel. The man was a wealthy southerner, and not just any southerner, but the loud, entitled sort who viewed the Highlands not as a living, breathing community, but as a personal theme park. This, Hamish knew from village gossip, was Barnaby Sterling. Sterling was a London property developer who had recently purchased the old Crofters' cottage on the hill, a cottage the entire village had quietly agreed should have been sold to young Angus MacDonald and his new bride. Instead, Sterling had swooped in, paid well over the asking price in cash, and immediately begun sending furious letters to the local council about the unsightly lobster pots in the harbour. "You there, my good man?" Sterling's voice barked, shattering the gloom. He had spotted Hamish's uniform through the fog. Sterling marched over, his walking stick clicking sharply against the damp tarmac. "Are you the local constable?" Hamish took his time. He screwed the cup back onto his thermos, gave Lugs a gentle pat on the head, and slowly rose to his full, towering height. He arranged his face into an expression of vacant, gormless simplicity, letting his jaw slacken just a fraction. "Aye, sir. Constable Macbeth, at your service," Hamish drawled, letting his Highland accent thicken until it was practically impenetrable to southern ears. "Is there a wee botheration?" Sterling looked Hamish up and down, taking in the unbuttoned collar, the scuffed boots, and the general air of profound laziness. A sneer curled the edge of his perfectly trimmed moustache. "Botheration? The botheration is that I have been subjected to an hour on a rattling tin can with chickens in the back. and there isn't a single soul here to assist me with my trunks. I am Barnaby Sterling. I own the property on the ridge. I expect you to make yourself useful and carry these bags to the Lochdubh Hotel." Hamish blinked slowly, his hazel eyes betraying absolutely nothing. Internally, he was already cataloguing the man. He noticed the expensive, heavy gold watch on Sterling's wrist, the nervous twitch in the man's left eyelid that contradicted his arrogant bluster, and the scent of expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask the sour smell of stale whiskey sweat. Barnaby Sterling was a man who liked to project power, but who was secretly rattled by something. "Ah, the bags," Hamish said slowly, scratching his chin as if the concept of luggage were a complex mathematical equation. "Well now, sir, I would be entirely delighted to assist you, but I am currently on official police surveillance." Sterling frowned, glancing around at the empty fog-drenched harbour. "Surveillance? On what? There's nothing here but seagulls." "Aye," Hamish agreed solemnly, "but they're highly suspicious seagulls, sir. Known to harbour stolen chips. Ye'd best ask Mr. Wellington, the minister, for a hand with your bags. He considers physical labour a fine path to spiritual salvation." Before Sterling could muster the outrage necessary to yell at him, Hamish touched 2 fingers to the brim of his cap, turned on his heel, and slouched away into the mist, Lugs trotting faithfully at his heels. As he walked back toward the police station, the damp cold seeping through his coat, Hamish felt a familiar prickle of unease at the back of his neck. Men like Barnaby Sterling loud, rich, and entirely devoid of self-awareness inevitably brought trouble to Lochdubh. They upset the delicate, gossipy ecosystem of the village. Hamish opened the door to the police station and was instantly comforted by the lingering smell of wood smoke and the quiet ticking of the clock. He moved to the stove to start his stew, putting the ringing telephone entirely out of his mind. The fog outside was thick, but Hamish knew a storm was coming anyway, and when it broke, it was going to completely ruin his peaceful week. 3 days of glorious, uninterrupted peace followed the arrival of Barnaby Sterling. The thick fog had lifted, replaced by a crisp, biting cold and a pale, watery sun that painted the frost-tipped heather in shades of gold. Constable Hamish Macbeth was having an exceptionally good Tuesday. He had managed to perfectly simmer a pot of venison stew on his cast-iron stove. He had successfully ignored 3 memos from headquarters regarding uniform ties, and he was currently stretched out in his armchair, a dog-eared paperback resting on his chest, while Lugs snored rhythmically by the hearth. Just as Hamish reached for his steaming mug of tea, the front door of the police station burst open, admitting a blast of freezing wind and a panicked village baker. Willie Lamont stood panting in the doorway, Flower dusting his woolen jumper, his eyes wide with shock. Hamish sighed, the sound conveying the profound tragedy of a man whose relaxation had been unjustly stolen. He didn't move from his chair. "Shut the door, Willie. You're letting out the heat, and coal is at a terrible price these days." "Hamish, it's the Englishman," Willie gasped, slamming the door shut and leaning heavily against it. "Mr. Sterling, he's awfully dead, Hamish." Down by the old pier, Hamish closed his eyes for a long, painful moment. He mourned his hot tea. He mourned the stew bubbling cheerfully on the stove. Most of all, he mourned the inevitable arrival of Detective Chief Inspector Blair, which would follow this news as surely as a hangover followed a Hogmanay party. "Are ye quite sure he's dead, Willie?" Hamish asked hopefully, swinging his long legs out of the chair and hunting for his boots. "Perhaps he's just taking a remarkably stiff nap in the bracing Highland air. Unless he breathes through the soles of his fancy boots, he's dead," Willie insisted, wringing his floury hands. "He's headfirst in one of Archie McLean's biggest lobster creels. His legs are sticking straight up, like a pair of rust-coloured flagpoles." Soon after, Hamish and Lugs trudged down the frozen shingle beach toward the ruined stone pier, jutting into the dark waters of the loch. The wind whipped at Hamish's coat, making his red hair dance wildly around his unbuttoned collar. He looked entirely dishevelled, the very picture of a useless country bobby, dragged out of bed against his will. A small crowd of villagers had gathered, murmuring in hushed tones, Hamish shooed them back with a lazy wave. "Move along now. Nothing to see but a tragedy and a ruined trap," he muttered, ducking under a line of drying nets to approach the body. Barnaby Stirling's demise was distinctly undignified. The Southerner had been forcefully jammed, head and shoulders first, into a massive lobster creel. Only his lower half remained visible, his +4s stained with seaweed, his pristine hiking boots pointing toward the pale sky. Lugs trotted forward, sniffed the boots, sneezed violently, and immediately lost interest. Wandering off to investigate a dead crab, Hamish crouched down, balancing easily on the slippery, frost-covered rocks. He shoved his hands deep into his coat pockets, his face an unreadable mask of sleepy indifference. To the watching villagers, he looked utterly clueless, perhaps slightly nauseated by the sight. In reality, Hamish's sharp hazel eyes were missing absolutely nothing. He noted the shattered glass face of Stirling's gold, wristwatch snagged on the wire mesh, its hands frozen at midnight. Also missing was the silver-tipped walking stick the man had paraded around the village. More importantly, he observed the ground. The frost around the pier was thick and crunchy, but there was only one set of heavy dragging scuff marks leading to the water's edge. Stirling hadn't walked here, he had been pulled, beneath the stench of low tide and old bait. There was a faint, powdery scent, talcum powder, or perhaps a heavily perfumed bath soap. It was entirely out of place here. "Well, this is a terrible mess," Hamish said aloud, his voice flat and devoid of urgency. He stood up, towering over the bizarre scene. The Englishman had been universally disliked, having spent his brief time in Lochdubh insulting the locals, threatening lawsuits over property lines, and loudly complaining about the lack of cellular service. Any one of 24 people could have gladly shoved him into a creel. But murder brought the Strathbane police. It brought forensics, reporters, and, worst of all, DCI Blair. Hamish looked out over the dark water, dreading the phone call he was about to make. He was going to have to play the village idiot flawlessly for the next week, carefully nudging Blair toward the truth without ever letting the man realize he was being led. If he solved it too quickly or too brilliantly, they would promote him. They would send him to a bleak, concrete office in a city, far away from his mountains, his stove, and his peace. "Right," Hamish sighed, addressing the protruding hiking boots. "Ye couldn't have just choked on a fishbone in your fancy hotel room, could ye? Ye had to make a production of it." He whistled for lugs, turning his back on the corpse to head for the nearest telephone, his stomach rumbling in quiet protest for the abandoned stew. The silence of Lochdubh did not stand a chance. Within 2 hours, the peace was not merely broken, it was thoroughly demolished. A series of screeching tires and slamming car doors announced the arrival of the Strathbane police, led by the man whose presence always made Hamish's jaw ache. Detective Chief Inspector Blair. Blair erupted from his unmarked sedan, like a cork from a bottle of cheap, angry champagne. He was a man of aggressive red complexion, with a mustache that looked like it had been glued onto his lip in a fit of pique. He marched toward the pier, his leather coat squeaking, his eyes scanning for someone to bully. When he spotted Hamish leaning against a telegraph pole, apparently contemplating the structural integrity of the local postbox, Blair's face turned an even more alarming shade of magenta. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice echoing off the surrounding cliffs and causing a flight of startled gulls to take to the air. "I see you're still standing around like a decorative garden gnome. What have you done to the crime scene? I specifically ordered you to stay away. You've probably contaminated every square inch with your incompetence." Hamish slowly straightened up, his movements calibrated to appear as if his joints were stiff from disuse. He offered a small, apologetic shrug. "I didn't touch a thing, sir. Just keeping the curious tourists away. It's a very distressing sight, sir. Dreadful for the local morale." "Don't give me your local morale rubbish," Blair snapped, pushing past him. He stopped abruptly at the sight of the deceased Mr. Stirling, still neatly wedged into the lobster creel. Blair stared at the protruding legs for a moment, then spun around to glare at Hamish. "Is this a joke? Have you been practicing your amateur dramatics again? Tell me you didn't set this up for a laugh." I haven't the imagination for such things, sir, Hamish replied, adopting a look of injured innocence. I'm just a humble constable. I was waiting for the experts. Experts? You haven't seen an expert in your life, Macbeth. You're the reason this district is a dumping ground for half-wits. Blair turned to his sergeant, a weary-looking man named Henderson, who was currently struggling to unfold a tripod. Henderson, get the camera, and get that dog away from the body before it marks its territory on the victim. Hamish whistled softly, and Luggs trotted over to sit dutifully by his feet, looking at Blair with a mixture of pity and mild interest. Blair spent the next hour in a state of high-octane fury, shouting orders that were almost entirely unnecessary. He paced the pier, snapping at his team, accusing the local fishermen of hiding evidence, and generally behaving as if he were storming a fortress rather than investigating a murder in a quiet village. He barely glanced at the clues Hamish had already noted: the scuff marks, the missing stick, the lack of struggle, choosing instead to focus on the most obvious and most convenient suspect. It's clear as day, Blair announced, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. He pointed a trembling finger toward the small huddle of villagers who were watching from a safe distance near the hotel. That man, the fisherman, McLean. He had a run-in with Sterling yesterday about his lobster pots. He's a hothead. Look at him. He's trying to blend into the scenery. Arrest him. But, sir, Hamish ventured mildly, shifting his weight, Archie McLean was at the pub all night. The barman, Mrs. McAllister, can verify that he didn't leave her sight from 8 until closing. Oh, shut up, Macbeth, Blair barked, his face pulsing with frustration. You're always trying to protect your little cronies. I know how this village works. You look the other way for a dram of whiskey or a bit of free salmon. Well, it stops today. We're going to run this investigation by the book. My book, Henderson. Bring McLean in for questioning. And don't let him eat anything. I want him hungry and nervous. Hamish watched with a heavy heart as the officers moved to surround a bewildered Archie McLean. The injustice of it was maddening, yet he kept his expression carefully blank. If he challenged Blair now, the man would only dig in his heels, convinced that Hamish was covering for the murderer. Blair needed to feel he was the one unearthing the truth, even if that truth was a complete fabrication. Sir, Hamish said, stepping forward as if he were finally finding his nerve. If I might be so bold, the victim was a very wealthy man. Perhaps the motive lies in his business dealings. He was in town to evict a few of the older tenants from the cottages he bought. There might be some resentment there. Resentment? You think a few angry pensioners shoved a man into a lobster trap? Blair let out a sharp, derisive laugh. You really are a peasant, Macbeth. Criminals are simple, violent creatures. They don't have time for real estate disputes. They have tempers, and they have grudges. Now, stop wasting my time with your theories, and go find me a cup of coffee, and not the swill you drink. Get me something that doesn't taste like swamp water. Hamish nodded, touching his cap in a gesture that was meant to be deferential but felt in his own mind like a silent protest. He turned away, his mind already racing. Blair was going to waste time bullying an innocent man, which would give Hamish exactly the opening he needed. He would provide the coffee, he would play the fool, and all the while, he would begin to untangle the web that had led to the end of Barnaby Sterling. As he walked toward the hotel, he felt the cold wind sharpen, signaling the approach of a long, difficult night. He wouldn't save Archie with logic, he realized. He would have to use something far more dangerous, the truth, hidden in plain sight. The atmosphere in the Lochdubh hotel was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the freezing weather and everything to do with the heavy, uniform-clad presence of the Strathbane police. DCI Blair had commandeered the lounge, turning the cozy, floral, upholstered space into a temporary command post. He sat at a small table, a mountain of files before him, barking into his mobile phone about forensic budgets and local incompetence. Hamish Macbeth, having been dismissed with a sneer and a vague instruction to stay out of the way, decided that the best way to be invisible was to be exactly where the gossip gathered. He drifted into the corner of the hotel bar, looking for all the world, like a man with nothing to do and nowhere to be. He didn't need to look for Mrs. McAllister. She was already there, her face a mask of pinched, judgmental disapproval. She was polishing a glass with a cloth that had seen better decades, her eyes fixed on the back of Blair's head. "The man is a menace, Hamish," she hissed, as soon as the constable leaned against the bar, asking me if I'd ever seen a murder before, like I'm a bloody tourist attraction, and him grilling poor Archie like he's a common cutthroat. Everyone knows Archie wouldn't hurt a fly unless the fly was stealing his bait. Hamish sighed, his gaze drifting toward the window. "Aye, it's a difficult time, Mrs. McAllister." Mr. Sterling wasn't the easiest man to like. Was he? Like him? The man was a walking disaster, she snorted. He came in here 2 nights ago, red in the face, shouting that the local riffraff were conspiring to ruin his investment. He was throwing money around like it was confetti, trying to bribe the local councilman, said he had dirt on everyone in the village. Even the minister wasn't safe from his wagging tongue. Hamish raised an eyebrow, his expression carefully vacant. Dirt? Did he say what kind, then? Oh, he was shouting it to the rafters. Claimed he'd found out who was really behind the odd anonymous letters that had been circulating about the development project. He said he had a meeting set up for last night at the pier to settle the score, once and for all. She paused, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. He was meeting someone, Hamish, someone who wasn't afraid of his money. Hamish nodded slowly, absorbing the information. A meeting at the pier. A man with secrets, facing someone who had everything to lose. He thanked Mrs. McAllister for the tea, which he had managed to score for free by looking particularly forlorn, and wandered toward the kitchen. He knew that if anyone had seen who Sterling was meeting, it would be the kitchen staff, who spent their evenings observing the world through the service door. He found the young cook, a bright-eyed lad named Callum, busy scrubbing pans. "Rough night, Callum?" Hamish asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Terrible, Hamish. The police have us on lockdown. I saw something last night, before all the commotion." Callum glanced toward the lounge to ensure Blair wasn't watching. "I was taking the bins out around 11. I saw Sterling standing by the pier, looking nervous. He was holding that fancy silver stick of his. He wasn't alone, either. Someone was with him. I couldn't see their faces, but they were wearing heavy, dark coats, and the perfume. It was the strongest scent of lavender I've ever smelled. Nearly knocked me over. Lavender." Hamish's mind locked onto the details. It matched the faint, powdery scent he had picked up at the crime scene. He thanked Callum and stepped out into the biting air, feeling the pieces of the puzzle begin to shift into an uncomfortable alignment. He wandered down the narrow, winding village street, nodding to the neighbours he passed. They were all huddled in their doorways whispering, their faces tight with anxiety. He stopped to talk to the local postmistress, a woman who knew every secret in Lochdubh by virtue of reading the back of every envelope. "Has anyone received any heavy mail lately?" Hamish asked, his voice casual. "Business stuff? Only for the Englishman," she replied immediately. He was expecting a package from London. Very heavy. Very formal. He was quite obsessed with it, checking the post every morning. "It arrived yesterday morning, but when I took it up to the house, he wouldn't open it, seemed almost afraid of it." Hamish pondered this as he walked back toward his station. Sterling had been a man who collected secrets, but he had also been a man who was clearly out of his depth. He hadn't been killed because of the development project, or at least not entirely. He had been killed because he had found something, or someone he shouldn't have. He looked up at the grey, oppressive sky. The wind was picking up, carrying the promise of snow. He realized he was no longer looking for a murderer, but for a ghost. The scent of lavender, the obsession with secrets, the package from London, everything pointed to a motive that was deeply disturbingly personal. And as he passed the village green, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. A single, silver-tipped walking stick, half buried in the snow near the edge of the woods, as if it had been discarded in a hurry. He looked around, the silence of the village pressing in on him, and knew for a fact that the killer was still right here, hidden behind the polite, terrified smiles of his neighbours. The cold was becoming absolute. a true Highland frost that threatened to crack the very stones of the cottages. Hamish, having retrieved the silver-tipped walking stick from the snow and tucked it securely into the deep interior pocket of his greatcoat, felt the weight of it pressing against his ribs like a guilty conscience. He needed a sounding board, someone who understood the social layers of Lochdubh better than he ever would, or cared to. There was only one person whose intellect he trusted, and whose ability to see through his lazy facade was both a comfort and a constant, sharp threat to his desire for a quiet life. Priscilla Halberton Smythe was standing by the stone wall that bordered her family's estate, watching the icy clouds race over the mountains. She was wrapped in an expensive, sensible cashmere coat, her sharp, intelligent face framed by a scarf that looked far too elegant for a village murder investigation. "I heard the news, Hamish," she said, not turning as he approached. Her voice was cool, precise, and carried the effortless authority of the landed gentry. "Blair is making a spectacular fool of himself. He's currently interrogating the postman as if the poor man personally murdered Sterling with a stamp." Hamish leaned against the wall, trying to look as though he were merely catching his breath after a particularly arduous walk. "Aye, he's a busy man. It's a shame he's so spectacularly wrong." Priscilla turned then, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. She didn't buy the gormless act. She never had. "You found something, didn't you? You have that specific, annoying look on your face. The one that says you're hiding a secret and enjoying it far too much." Hamish pulled the silver-tipped stick from his coat and held it out. "Found this near the woods. Abandoned. Doesn't seem like the sort of thing a man like Sterling would just leave behind, especially if he was as paranoid as people say." Priscilla took the stick, examining the handle with practiced, aristocratic focus. "This isn't just a walking aid. Look at the craftsmanship. It's an antique, likely part of a set. Sterling was a collector of provenance, Hamish. He bought things he thought gave him status. But he didn't own this. I saw him with a plain, black-handled stick yesterday morning. This was meant to belong to someone else." Hamish felt a jolt of recognition. Someone else who might have a reason to want it back. Or someone who gave it to him as a token of something. Or someone who used it to lure him, Priscilla mused, her brow furrowing. "Think about the social dynamics, Hamish. Sterling was trying to buy his way into local circles. He was hosting dinners, inviting the influential, trying to curate a persona. But he was also a bully. Who did he push too far? Who had the standing to be offended by his arrogance, but enough hidden vulnerability to be desperate enough to kill him?" Hamish looked toward the village, his mind replaying the scene in the kitchen. Lavender. What if it wasn't about the cottages? What if it was about a reputation? He mentioned having dirt on people. Suppose he wasn't just talking about local politics. What if he found out something about a family name? Priscilla sighed, a sound of genuine, weary disappointment. "You're suggesting it's one of the old guards. Someone who couldn't afford to have their history scrutinized by a man like Sterling. It's a very sharp, very nasty motive. It's much cleaner than a business dispute. It's about survival." She stepped closer, her tone softening slightly. "Hamish, be careful. Blair is looking for a violent criminal, because that's all he can understand. If you start digging into the private lives of people who matter, he won't be the only one shouting at you. You'll have the entire social structure of the region coming down on your head." "I never like trouble, Priscilla. You know that. I know you like to pretend you don't. But you're the only person in this village who actually cares about the truth. And that is a dangerous habit." She handed the stick back, her fingers lingering for a fraction of a second against his. "If you're going to set a trap, make sure you don't step into it yourself. Who smells like lavender in this village, Hamish? Think about who uses such an old-fashioned, expensive scent. It's not something the average villager buys at the chemist." Hamish thought about the village socials, the refined air of the manor houses, and the subtle, lingering traces of perfume he had encountered over the years. It was a clue that cut through the noise of Blair's shouting and the cold, biting wind. "I have an idea," Hamish said. his voice dropping into a register that lacked all pretense of laziness. "But I need to confirm it, and I need Blair to stay focused on his wrong suspects for another few hours." "Go then," Priscilla said, turning back toward her estate. "But don't be a hero. It's untidy, and it never suits you." Hamish watched her go, the weight of the investigation shifting from a mere nuisance to a complex, personal game. He knew exactly who used that scent, and the realization chilled him more than the wind ever could. It wasn't the fisherman. It wasn't the developer. It was someone who had been standing right there, smiling at the police, pretending to be as horrified as everyone else. The killer wasn't hiding. They were simply waiting for the outsiders to pack their bags and leave, unaware that the useless constable was the only one paying attention to the scent in the air. The following morning, the atmosphere in Lochdubh had soured into something truly malicious. The local constabulary, or rather, the chaotic shouting circus that DCI Blair had brought with him, had officially descended upon the innocent. Archie McLean was not alone in his misery. Blair had expanded his net, rounding up anyone who had ever had a crossword with Barnaby Sterling. The village jail, a tiny drafty cell that had historically been used to store confiscated fishing nets, was now packed with 3 shivering, bewildered locals who were currently being lectured on the moral decline of rural Scotland by a red-faced Henderson. Hamish Macbeth, observing this absurdity from the safety of the station's doorstep, felt a twinge of genuine annoyance. The police were so obsessed with the idea of a revenge killing by a disgruntled neighbour that they were ignoring the glaring contradictions in the evidence. They had spent the entire night processing the crime scene, but had somehow managed to overlook the fact that the boot prints in the frost near the pier were not, in fact, heavy-duty fishing boots at all. They were high-end, soft-soled Italian loafers, the kind favoured by people who spent more time in boardrooms than on trawlers. Hamish sighed, finishing his coffee, and retreating inside to find his notebook. He needed to plant a seed of doubt in Blair's mind, a seed that would force the inspector to look away from his preferred scapegoats. He grabbed a pen and scribbled a note, mimicking the stiff, formal hand of a concerned citizen. It was a simple, anonymous tip, suggesting that the missing package Sterling had been so obsessed with had actually been seen in the possession of a certain city lawyer who had been visiting the hotel. He took the note, folded it, and made his way back to the hotel. The lobby was a war zone of paperwork and discarded coffee cups. Blair was currently shouting into his radio, his face an alarming shade of plum. Hamish moved with his characteristic, shuffling gait, dropping the note onto the pile of files on the reception desk, and then retreating to the kitchen to check on the tea supply. When he returned to the lounge a few minutes later, the dynamic had shifted perfectly. Blair was clutching the note, his eyes darting around the room. He had already abandoned his questioning of Archie McLean, who was being shuffled out of the station, looking shocked. "Henderson, look at this," Blair barked, waving the paper. "An anonymous tip, a city lawyer. It fits the profile perfectly. Sterling was a property developer. He had dealings with legal types. This isn't a fisherman's grudge, it's a professional hit." Hamish stood in the background, staring at the floor with an expression of mild, vacant surprise. "Oh dear, a lawyer, you say? That does sound much more serious than a bit of fuss over lobster pots." Blair didn't even look at him. He was already shouting orders for his team to call the local registry office and start tracking the movements of anyone who had visited the village from the city in the last 48 hours. The red herring was swimming perfectly. Blair was now so convinced that a city professional was involved that he had completely discarded the local suspects. He wouldn't look at the villagers anymore. He would be too busy chasing ghosts in city suits. However, as the excitement in the room escalated, Hamish caught a glimpse of someone standing by the bar. It was Mrs. Gable, the widow of the village's former mayor. She was watching the police with an expression that was, for all intents and purposes, entirely too calm. She was wearing a thick, elegant wool cardigan that smelled faintly, unmistakably of lavender. Hamish's heart gave a strange, cold thump. He watched her as she turned away from the scene, her movements fluid and utterly unbothered by the chaos around her. She wasn't one of the people Blair had rounded up. She wasn't even on the police's radar. She was the picture of the local elite, untouchable, refined, and above suspicion. He remembered what Priscilla had said. someone who had the standing to be offended by Sterling's arrogance, but had a hidden vulnerability. Mrs. Gable's husband had left her in significant debt, a fact that was buried deep beneath layers of estate management and charitable donations. If Sterling had found out if he had been using his dirt to leverage the old guard, Mrs. Gable had the most to lose. Hamish felt the weight of the silver-tipped stick in his pocket. It was a piece of the puzzle he hadn't yet shared with anyone. If he showed it to Blair now, the inspector would immediately start shouting at the wrong people, potentially ruining an innocent life. Hamish knew he had to hold on to the evidence, at least until he could be sure. He watched Mrs. Gable walk out of the hotel, her posture rigid, her head held high. The police were busy chasing a phantom lawyer, and the real killer was walking right out the front door. Hamish bit his lip, his hands trembling slightly in his pockets. He was playing a game of cat and mouse, but the cat was the one holding the badge, and the mouse was walking away through the snow, safe for another hour. He had to be smarter, faster, and much, much quieter than he had ever been before. He turned and followed her into the biting wind, the silence of the village closing in around them like a shroud. The wind had shifted, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of an approaching blizzard that promised to seal the glen entirely. Hamish followed Mrs. Gable at a discreet distance, his boots crunching rhythmically on the frozen track. She wasn't heading toward her manor house, but toward the abandoned croft at the edge of the woods. The very one Barnaby Sterling had purchased. The irony was heavy. The man who had sought to own the past was now, in a sense, being reclaimed by it. Hamish ducked behind a gnarled rowan tree as Mrs. Gable reached the porch. She didn't knock. She had a key. She let herself inside with a practiced motion, and Hamish realized that Sterling hadn't just been researching the locals. He had been systematically stripping away their history, item by item. He waited, counting the seconds, until he crept toward the side window. The glass was frosted, but he wiped a small patch clear. Inside, the cottage was cold and sterile, purged of all warmth. Mrs. Gable was standing in the center of the room, not looking at the furniture, but at a small, locked mahogany chest that sat on a makeshift desk. She looked different now. Not the composed, elegant widow, but a woman vibrating with a terrifying, icy rage. He watched as she retrieved a small iron key from her handbag, the same bag that smelled of lavender, and opened the chest. She didn't pull out money or deeds. She pulled out a stack of letters, old, yellowed, and tied with a fraying velvet ribbon. Hamish understood it then. It wasn't about the cottages. It was about the name. Mrs. Gable's late husband, the revered former mayor, hadn't been the saint the village worshipped. The letters clearly contained evidence of a long-standing scandal, a series of bribes, a fraudulent land deal, and perhaps something even more damaging involving the local school board. Barnaby Sterling hadn't just been a property developer. He had been a blackmailer, a man who built his empire by weaponizing the secrets of those who believed they were untouchable. Sterling had threatened to publish these letters, to drag the Gable name through the mud and destroy the only thing the widow had left, her social standing and the memory of her husband. She had tried to bargain to buy him off. But Sterling, in his arrogance, had pushed too far. He hadn't just wanted her money, he wanted her to beg. Hamish stepped back from the window, his heart heavy. The petty murder was anything but. It was a desperate, primal act of protection. Mrs. Gable wasn't a villain in the traditional sense. She was a woman who had lived a lie for 30 years and would do anything to keep the truth from turning to ash. But as he watched, he saw her pull something else from the chest, a small, dark vial. She hesitated, then poured a small amount of the liquid into a glass of water she had brought with her. Her hands were shaking violently. This wasn't the end of her cleanup. She was planning to destroy the evidence. And perhaps, given the dark look in her eyes, she was planning to destroy herself, along with it. The realization hit Hamish with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just dealing with a murderer, he was dealing with a woman at the end of her tether. He had to stop her, not for the sake of the law, but for the sake of the life that was currently unraveling in that drafty, stolen room. He had the silver-tipped stick in his pocket, the one he had found near the woods. It belonged to her husband, an antique of the Gable estate. Sterling must have snatched it from her during their final fatal meeting at the pier, perhaps as a final act of humiliation before she had turned the tables on him. Hamish didn't reach for his handcuffs. He reached for his wits. He knew Blair was busy with his phantom lawyers, which meant the village was effectively his to manage. He had to intervene before the tragedy became a double death. He walked toward the front door, his boots heavy, his mind racing. He had to play the part of the slow constable one last time, to disarm her with his apparent incompetence, rather than force her into a corner where she would have nothing left to lose. He took a deep breath, adjusted his cap until it sat at a rakish, unconcerned angle, and knocked on the door. He didn't wait for an answer. He simply pushed it open, his face arranging itself into that familiar, gormless expression that had served him so well for years. "Evening, Mrs. Gable," he drawled, his voice echoing in the cold, empty room. "Terribly sorry to intrude. I was just out for a walk with Lugs and saw your light on. I was wondering, do ye happen to have a spot of spare sugar for my tea? The hotel is absolutely overrun with police, and they've locked up everything but the cutlery." He saw the color drain from her face, the vial clutched tightly in her hand. He didn't look at it. He just stared at the floor, his eyes wide and vacant, as if he were the most harmless, most thoughtless man in all of Scotland. He had walked into the trap, and now he had to make sure she was the one who walked out. Mrs. Gable stood frozen, the small glass vial clutched in her hand like a dagger. Her eyes darted from Hamish to the fireplace, then back to the mahogany chest, which lay open and incriminating on the desk. For a heartbeat, the silence in the room was so profound that Hamish could hear the rhythmic ticking of the watch he had hidden deep within his own pocket. He didn't move. He kept his hands visible, loose at his sides, his shoulders slumped in that familiar weary posture of a man who spent his life waiting for tea water to boil. He let his gaze wander around the room, stopping to inspect a cobweb in the corner with the intensity of a man who had never seen an arachnid before. "Terrible business, this," Hamish muttered, shaking his head. "Mr. Blair is in the right state. He's convinced he's looking for a high-powered solicitor from London. Seems he's found a paper trail, leading right back to a law firm that once handled the late Mr. Gable's estate affairs. The poor man is having a fit, trying to coordinate with the city authorities to have them brought in for questioning by morning." He saw the tiny muscle in Mrs. Gable's jaw tighten. She hadn't expected the police to turn their gaze toward her late husband's history. Not yet. She had counted on the Sassenach connection being the primary focus of the investigation. "Is that so?" she whispered, her voice like grinding stones. She moved slightly, tucking the vial into the fold of her cardigan, her movements calculated and sharp. "The police are looking into the Gable estate? That seems entirely irrelevant to the murder of that unpleasant man." "Oh, you'd think so, wouldn't you?" Hamish said, taking a step toward the center of the room, his eyes still fixed on the floorboards, as if he were trying to memorize the wood grain. "But that's the trouble with Inspector Blair. He gets a bee in his bonnet about legal precedents and long-term grudges. He's currently having his men sweep the properties Sterling bought. He's going to turn every stone in this village, looking for any document that links the victim to his original legal representatives. He mentioned something about a missing collection of correspondence being the key to the whole mess." Hamish took another step, closing the distance just enough to be conversational, but not enough to be threatening. He had to lead her to the bait. "He's coming here, actually. Said he wanted to verify the original deeds for this croft. Should be here within the hour. Once he's done bullying the postmaster. He's quite obsessed with the idea that the killer left behind a calling card of some sort. A personal item, he called it, something that would tie the victim to their past." Mrs. Gable's hand went to her throat. She looked at the mahogany chest, then back to Hamish. He could see the panic beginning to override her cold, calculated exterior. If the police came here and found the letters, her life, the life she had guarded with such murderous intent, would be reduced to a tabloid scandal. "I don't see why I should be bothered at this hour," she said, her voice strained. "I have no knowledge of Sterling's business." "Of course not," Hamish agreed. his voice soothing and thick with artificial ignorance. "But I told him," I said. "Inspector, Mrs. Gable is a woman of high standing. She wouldn't have anything to do with such a messy business." But he's a persistent man, especially when he's shouting. I thought, if I could just find whatever it is he's looking for, perhaps some old paperwork or a stray trinket, I could hand it over and save you the trouble of his questioning. He's such a loud man, isn't he? He'd likely track mud all over your carpets. He was offering her an out, or so it seemed. He was giving her a chance to discover the letters and turn them over to a harmless constable, thereby cleaning up the crime scene before Blair arrived. It was a gamble that relied entirely on her arrogance. She had to believe that the stupid policeman was too slow to understand what he was looking at. "Where is it, then?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "Where is this evidence he thinks he has?" Hamish reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver-tipped walking stick. He placed it gently on the desk, right next to the chest. "He thinks the killer dropped this nearby. He's going to be looking for a matching set. If there's anything else here that shouldn't be, I'd be happy to take it." "Well, file it in the wrong cabinet. It's easy enough to do. I'm quite prone to misplacing things." The trap was laid. He had validated her fear, given her an opportunity to remove the evidence, and presented himself as the perfect, bumbling pawn to facilitate it. "Mrs. E. Poe." Gable stared at the silver-tipped stick, her breathing hitching. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and closed the lid of the chest. "You think you can hide it?" she challenged, her eyes searching his face for a hint of guile. "I hide everything, Mrs. Gable," Hamish replied, his gaze finally meeting hers for the briefest, sharpest second. "My superiors think I'm an idiot. It's the safest place to be." She stood there, trapped by her own desperation, caught between the certainty of Blair's incoming raid and the questionable salvation of the village bobby. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes of the lonely croft, signaling that the time for choices was rapidly coming to an end. The air in the small croft had grown heavy, the scent of burning peat from the dying fire mingling with the sharp, medicinal sting of lavender. Mrs. Gable stared at the silver-tipped walking stick, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the mahogany chest. For a long, suffocating moment, there was no sound save for the frantic whistling of the wind against the eaves. Hamish stood perfectly still, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, his face a canvas of practiced, vacant simplicity. He allowed his posture to slump, his shoulders rounding as if under the weight of a particularly long and confusing day. "You're a clever one, aren't you, Constable?" she finally said, her voice dropping to a dangerous icy register that held no warmth at all. She moved away from the desk, her stride no longer the measured step of an aristocrat, but the predatory movement of a cornered animal. "You pretend to be a fool to catch the world off guard. You think that if you play the part well enough, people will simply forget that you're watching them." Hamish didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He merely tilted his head, letting his mouth hang open just a fraction. "I don't know about clever, ma'am. I just know that things have a way of missing in this village, and I've always been quite good at finding them. But I'm not here for riddles. I'm here because Mr. Blair is going to be knocking on your door within the hour, and he won't be looking for sugar." Mrs. Gable's eyes flickered toward the door, then back to the desk where the incriminating letters lay hidden. "And you? You think you can just walk in here, act the buffoon, and expect me to hand over my life to you? You're nothing but a local embarrassment. A man who wastes his days poaching salmon and avoiding work." "I might be all that," Hamish agreed, his voice soft, almost rhythmic, "but I'm also the only person who knows what happened at the pier. And I'm the only person who knows that you didn't mean for it to go that far. It was a confrontation, wasn't it? He pushed and you pushed back, and the lock took the rest. You didn't set out to be a killer. You set out to protect your home." The mention of the lock seemed to break something inside her. Mrs. Gable let out a harsh, jagged sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "He was going to ruin everything. He was a parasite, draining the life from this valley, buying up the past just to strip it bare. He mocked the mayor, he mocked my husband, and he told me that my reputation was worth exactly what he could get for it in the London papers. He deserved the cold, Hamish. He deserved the dark. She reached into her cardigan, and before Hamish could react, she withdrew the small glass vial. Her movements were blurred with frantic energy. She lunged toward the glass of water she had left on the desk, intent on finishing the act she had started. "Don't," Hamish said, his voice shedding its drawl and dropping into a tone of quiet, iron-hard authority. He didn't need to be fast in a traditional sense, he just needed to be precise. As she tipped the vial, Hamish stepped forward, his long arms snaking out with the speed of a striking viper. He caught her wrist mid-air, the strength in his grip, surprising an echo of the endurance required to survive Highland winters and long nights on the hills. The vial clattered to the floor, shattering into 1,000 glistening shards, the liquid spreading across the rough, unvarnished floorboards. Mrs. Gable struggled, her nails digging into the back of his hand, but Hamish held firm. He didn't tighten his grip. He simply created a barrier, a physical manifestation of the boundary she had crossed. "Let me go," she hissed, her face contorted in a mask of desperation. "You don't understand. I can't face them. I can't let them see the ruin of the name." "I understand more than you think," Hamish replied, his gaze locked onto hers. He didn't see a murderer. He saw a person who had allowed the weight of history to crush her own soul. "But this isn't the way. You don't have to carry the Gable name alone, and you certainly don't have to end it here, in the dark." She went limp then, the adrenaline leaving her body as quickly as it had arrived. She slumped against him, her head bowed, her composure finally shattered. The room felt incredibly small and suffocating. Hamish held her steady, his face grave. He felt the cold seep into the room through the floorboards, and for a moment, he felt the immense sadness of the situation, the pride, the secrets, and the inevitable, crushing weight of the past. He reached into his pocket and produced a pair of worn, steel handcuffs. It was the moment he had dreaded throughout the entire investigation. By making the arrest, he would be noticed, he would be questioned. He would be forced to explain how a lazy village constable had managed to connect a lavender-scented vial, a missing antique stick, and a series of social grudges that had escaped the notice of the Strathbane police. He clicked the cuffs into place, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. He didn't take pleasure in it. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had done his duty, and, in the process, had made his own life infinitely more complicated. "I have to take you in, Mrs. Gable," he said quietly, his voice heavy with a profound, weary regret. "But I'll make sure they know it wasn't a cold-blooded hunt. It was a moment of madness. That matters." Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall, drifting down to cover the tracks leading to the croft. The trap had closed, but the victory felt hollow, cold, and entirely, utterly lonely. He guided her toward the door, ready to face the long, bitter trek back to the village, knowing that the peace of Lochdubh had been irrevocably scarred by the truth. The trek back to the village was a slow, grueling march through an increasingly hostile landscape. The wind had become a physical presence, driving sheets of stinging snow horizontally across the path. Mrs. Gable walked with a hollow, mechanical cadence, her wrists bound, her head shielded by a heavy wool shawl. Hamish walked beside her, his hand firmly but gently on her elbow, shielding her from the worst of the gusts. Every step was a struggle, a physical labor that matched the mental exhaustion he felt pressing against his temples. As they reached the outskirts of Lochdubh, the lights of the hotel glowed through the blizzard like dying embers. Hamish could see the silhouettes of the police vehicles, their blue lights rotating in a hypnotic, rhythmic pulse that cut through the white veil. This was it, the moment where the charade had to reach its climax. He needed to ensure that DCI Blair took the reins, that the case was tied up in a manner that satisfied the bureaucracy without drawing a single shred of unwanted attention to his own deductive methods. Hamish maneuvered them through the back entrance of the hotel, steering Mrs. Gable toward the lounge. The scene inside was chaotic. Blair was standing in the center of the room, his face an apoplectic shade of crimson, berating a junior officer for a missing file. When the door swung open and the wind roared into the room, sending papers flying like frightened birds, the room went deathly silent. Blair spun around, his eyes widening as they landed on Hamish and his charge. "Macbeth, what in the name of all that is holy are you doing? I told you to go and get me some decent coffee hours ago. And who is this? Why is Mrs. Gable out in this weather?" Hamish didn't wait for him to finish. He assumed the slouch, let his jaw slacken, and tilted his head as if he were trying to recall a forgotten grocery list. He nudged Mrs. Gable toward the center of the floor, then stood back. Looking for all the world like a man who had just stumbled into a surprise party he didn't want to attend. "It's a long story, sir," Hamish drawled, his voice pitched to just the right level of weary incompetence. "I was just doing my rounds, as ye requested, when I found the poor woman wandering near the old croft. She was in a state, sir. Said she'd had a bit of a tumble and had been confused. But then I noticed she was clutching this." He reached into his pocket and produced the silver-tipped walking stick, holding it out as if he were offering a particularly dirty piece of scrap metal. "I remembered the fancy stick from the pier, sir. The one with the silver handle. It looked a bit like this one, didn't it? So I thought, well, maybe Mrs. Gable had seen something when she was out walking. I asked her about it, and she started talking. It was a bit confusing, sir, very emotional. I didn't want to overthink it, seeing as I'm not really trained for high-level forensic stuff, but she mentioned something about an argument and a push." Blair's eyes locked onto the stick. His anger evaporated, replaced by a predatory, self-aggrandizing hunger. He snatched the stick from Hamish's hand, holding it up to the light, his chest swelling with the weight of his own perceived brilliance. "She confessed to you?" Blair demanded, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "Well, sir," Hamish said, scratching his head and looking at his boots, "I wouldn't call it a confession. That sounds like a proper police word, doesn't it? She was just very upset, talking about how the Englishman had been bothering her husband's legacy. I just listened. I figured, since you're the expert on the professional side of things, I should bring her straight to you. I wouldn't want to get the procedures all wrong and ruin your fine work, sir." Blair's expression softened, the condescension returning in full force. He clapped a heavy, self-satisfied hand on Hamish's shoulder, almost knocking the wind out of him. "You did well, Macbeth, unexpectedly well. It seems you managed to stumble onto the right path, even if it took you all day. You're lucky I was here to provide the structure for this investigation. If it were up to you, we'd still be chasing local legends." "Oh, absolutely, sir," Hamish agreed, his voice filled with such genuine wide-eyed relief that Blair's suspicion vanished entirely. "I'm just glad it's over. I was worried I'd have to start filing those incident reports in triplicate. I'm not sure I remember how. To be honest," Blair scoffed, already turning to his team to prepare the official statement. "Don't worry about the paperwork. I'll handle the press release myself. I'll make sure it's noted that my team, with your assistance in the field, conducted a thorough, high-level inquiry that led to the capture of the suspect. You can go back to your station now, Macbeth. And for heaven's sake, get that uniform pressed. You look like a potato sack." Hamish offered a lazy, grateful salute, his heart light. He hadn't been promoted. He hadn't been transferred. He hadn't been recognized as anything more than a useful, bumbling subordinate. As Blair began to loudly dictate his brilliant theory of the crime to a stenographer, Hamish quietly slipped out of the room. The snow was falling harder now, obscuring the path, but he didn't mind. The village was quiet, the mystery was put to rest, and best of all, the next few days promised to be as gloriously, wonderfully, and beautifully boring as a man could ever hope for. The blizzard had spent its fury by the following morning, leaving Lochdubh transformed into a silent, pristine landscape of blinding white. The sky was an impossible crystalline blue, and the air was so sharp, it felt like breathing crushed diamonds. For Hamish Macbeth, the world felt entirely right again. The village had resumed its slow, rhythmic heartbeat, the panic of the previous days having melted away as quickly as the frost under the midday sun. DCI Blair and his circus of shouting officers had finally departed, their sirens fading into the distance, leaving behind nothing but a few deep ruts in the snow and a collective sigh of relief that seemed to ripple through the entire glen. Hamish sat in the kitchen of his small, lonely station. The cast-iron stove, humming with the steady, comforting heat of a fresh fire. The smell of strong, dark coffee, his third cup of the morning, mingled with the savoury, hearty scent of a stew that had been simmering since dawn. It was a simple, perfect existence. Outside, the loch was a sheet of dark glass, reflecting the snow-dusted peaks that stood as silent, eternal guardians of his domain. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a rising star in the Metropolitan Police. And he certainly wasn't an inspector in a bustling concrete city. He was simply Hamish, the village Bobby, and that was more than enough. Lugs were stretched out across the rug, his paws twitching as he chased dream rabbits through the heather. Every so often, the dog would let out a soft, satisfied woof, a reminder that the world had returned to its proper, predictable order. Hamish leaned back in his chair, his long legs stretched toward the stove, a dog-eared book open on his lap. He wasn't reading, though. He was just listening to the silence, savouring the absence of telephones, the absence of paperwork, and the absolute absence of DCI Blair's booming, arrogant voice. He thought about Mrs. Gable. She was in a facility in Strathbane now, where she would face the consequences of a moment that had destroyed a lifetime of carefully curated prestige. It was a tragedy, certainly, but it was a quiet one. The village had already moved on. Gossip in Lochdubh was a renewable resource. They had already traded the mystery of the Englishman in the lobster pot for the latest rumours about the quality of the winter wool yield and the upcoming church raffle. It was exactly how he wanted it. The truth of what happened, the lavender, the letters, the desperation was tucked away in his mind. A secret he would carry, but one he would never speak of. It was the burden of the job, the quiet price of keeping his village safe and his own life undisturbed. A soft tap at the front door interrupted his thoughts. Hamish sighed, marking his page and rising with the practiced, leisurely grace of a man who was in no hurry to meet the world. He opened the door to find Mrs. McAllister standing there, bundled in a thick, wool-lined parka, holding a basket covered in a crisp linen cloth. "I thought you might be needing this, Hamish," she said, her tone brisk, but her eyes warm with a flicker of genuine appreciation. "The police ate everything in the hotel larder, and I imagine your own supplies were stretched thin. It's a fresh loaf of soda bread and a bit of butter, and don't you dare try to pay me for it." Hamish took the basket, the warmth of the bread seeping through the cloth. "Thank ye, Mrs. McAllister. That's far too kind. I was just about to have my stew, and this will be the perfect companion. Just see that ye keep that stove of yours running," she replied, turning to leave. "It's a long winter, and I don't want to be hearing about you freezing in this drafty barn of a station. And Hamish, good work. Everyone knows who really solved it, even if that loud man from the city took the credit. We appreciate you looking out for us." Before Hamish could respond, she was already marching back down the path, her boots crunching in the snow. Hamish stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her go, a small, genuine smile playing on his lips. He realized then that he didn't need the glory. He didn't need the promotions or the accolades. Being known, being trusted by the people of Lochdubh was the only reward that mattered. He closed the door and bolted it, the sound of the latch clicking into place, serving as a final punctuation mark on the week's events. He returned to his chair, set the bread on the table, and poured himself another cup of coffee. He was back in his own world, safe within the embrace of the mountains, with nothing ahead of him but the quiet, slow march of the seasons. The mystery was gone. The outsider was buried, and the peace of his beloved home was restored. He picked up his book, settled into the warmth, and allowed himself the luxury of a long, deep, and utterly deserved nap, content in the knowledge that for once there was absolutely nothing to do and nowhere he needed to be. Life in Lochdubh was, once again, perfectly, wonderfully, and beautifully quiet.